G.I. Joe was a popular toy line that made a lot of money in the 80s, so that means a lot of toy companies try to rip it off. Let's look at 10 times another toy company tried to rip off G.I. Joe. Welcome back to the Junk Room, everybody. It's me, the Jumpman, coming back at you with another video. Can you believe it? I know I sure can, but it's time for another video. Today we're going to look at 10 generic wannabe G.I. Joe lines. As I was saying in the teaser opener, G.I. Joe was a huge toy line in the early 80s, and of course it was huge in the 60s and somewhat in the 70s, but when they went small in the 80s, it opened a whole new market, and G.I. Joe was back in a big thing. So it means these smaller, lesser, bigger companies wanted their own G.I. Joe hit, or at least make something look like G.I. Joe. That way grandparents buying G.I. Joe for their grandson for Christmas would pick up the wrong thing. And we're going to look at 10 times a toy company tried to make their G.I. Joe line. This should be interesting. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, growing up, I didn't have G.I. Joe. I had one that had a motorcycle. I got it at a Christmas party, but other than that, I never really had G.I. Joe. I didn't hate it, just never got into it. Didn't really watch the cartoons or anything, just never got into it. I was just, I was into my Star Wars thing, so it's nothing against G.I. Joe. So let's go with number 10, and this one's from, believe it or not, Woolworths. That's right, still the Woolworths. You know what I'm talking about, that department. In 1980, they released Action Hero to try to get some of that G.I. Joe dollars. And at number 9, we have American Defense. This was released by toy company Remco. Great toy company, had a lot of great toys, but here they were in 1989 trying to get some more of that G.I. Joe cash with American Defenders. But this wasn't the only American Defenders line. Nope, at number 8 we have American Defenders. This was a line released in 1986. Yep, 1986, with the same name that Remco took a few years later. Can you believe it? Well, here they are trying to rip off G.I. Joe. So let's go to number 7. This is a line by Toy Max, and it's going to shock you, but this toy line is called American Defenders. Was that 3 American Defender line? And this one is 1986. That's right, the same time the other toy company was doing it, this toy was doing it. It's crazy. I don't think I've ever seen a toy line with the same name within the same year. Just weird. So let's move on to number 6. And this is Remco again, and this time it's American Force. And it looks like a toy line we've already seen before. But here's Remco's first attempt to try to get some of those G.I. Joe dollars. And then at number 5, we have Bravo Company. I like that very manly name, Bravo Company. This was released by Small World Importing Corporation. I know, what a long name for a toy company. And it was released at the end of the 80s, 1989. Still technically the 80s, but a lot of time when I think of 1989, it reminds me more of the 90s than it does the 80s. And at number 4, Bronze Bombers. That's right, Bronze Bombers. Bronze Bombers, the action figure line. Released in 1988, this was an all African-American line, released by a company that was famous for doing toys aimed for African-American children of the 80s in the U.S. This is the company that brought you Sunman, that looked like a He-Man toy, which eventually became a He-Man toy. And at number 3, we have Demon Ranger. This doesn't sound like much of a G.I. Joe ripoff, but it is. Demon Ranger. I know it sounds more like that heavy metal band you saw open up for Quiet Riot back in 1982, but it's not. Demon Ranger. Released by Concept Toy Company. And at number 2, we have the wannabe G.I. Joe line, Eagle Force by Migo. At this time in the early 80s, Migo was doing everything they could to try to stay afloat after they turned down the Star Wars line in 1977. They were trying to do everything they could to get some money, and here they are trying to get some G.I. Joe dollar. And the number 1 action figure line to rip off G.I. Joe wasn't even released in the U.S. This is from the UK toy company Powell Toy. You know, famous for making the Star Wars figures over there instead of Kenner. Well, what did they have to rip off G.I. Joe? Action Man, Action Force. Oh, God, these are the closest G.I. Joe wannabes I've ever seen. This is a blatant, G.I. Joe should have sued somebody and then loaded up the tank and went over there with Snake Eyes and kicked some UK ass. This is pure 100% ripoff. Oh, Action Man. I don't even like the name, but they couldn't even come up with a good name for it. Action Man. Oh, Action Force. What do they do, spend like 2 minutes in the board meeting coming up with that one? When there's something like G.I. Joe, what can we call it? I don't know. It's action and they're men. Action Man. That sounds bloody good to me. Action Man. Anyway, kind of short video. That's 10 times a toy company try to rip off G.I. Joe, the great American hero. I know it's supposed to be America's hero, but you know who my hero was in the 80s? Zero Candy Bar. Zero was my hero. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Junkman, how can Zero be a hero? Well, let me tell you how Zero is a wonderful thing. In fact, Zero is my hero. You're saying, Junkman, how can Zero be a hero? Well, you know, there's all kinds of heroes in this world, you know. A man can be a hero for winning a famous battle that he fought, or by studying very hard and becoming a weightless astronaut. Oh, that's a hero for sure. And then there's heroes of all sorts, like heroes from just playing sports. Oh, like when I was in the 3rd grade and all the girls thought John Gorman was a hero. I never really understood that. But heroes don't have to be a grown person, you know. A hero can be a big dog who came to your rescue, or a little boy who's smart enough to know what to do. Yeah, but let me tell you about my favorite hero. My hero is Zero. Such a funny little hero. But if you'll come along, we'll count on the fingers and toes.
Hey, Jumpman channel popping though.
Thank you, sir, for that unsolicited testimony.